At Serendipity Wines, we work passionately, relentlessly, and creatively to provide great customer service.
We treat our customers and our suppliers' business as if it were our own.
We build relationships through openness, empathy, and inclusiveness.
We encourage and celebrate curiosity, ambition, and achievement.
We take time to plan so that we can perform at our best.
We do the right thing.
We are proud sponsors of the Lift Collective 2021 conference and humbled by the opportunity to support and engage in this crucial conversation.
We know that we are not where we should be or where we want to be as a company or an industry with regards to diversity and inclusion.
But we're committed to better and more frequent conversations, individually and collectively.
And at each level of our business, we will continue taking steps towards a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable wine industry.
Hello, welcome. I'm so excited to be here with you today. My name is Tanya Morningstar, darling, and I guess I'll begin by introducing myself a little bit. I have been in the wine industry for almost 30 years in some capacity or another. I've worked in just about every aspect of the industry, and I've been teaching for almost 20 years and teaching full-time for about 10. One of my specialties is wine history, and I'm really proud to have just created a fully asynchronous wine history course for Napa Valley Wine Academy. But I also have a small wine school in Seattle called Cellar Muse, where I'm the approved program provider for the wine scholar certifications. And I'm also a approved instructor for WSET levels 1 through 4. So that's about me. I didn't have somebody else to introduce me. So I look forward to hearing from you all, and welcome. You can see actually here on this first slide, I've got lots of my achievements and distinctions listed. And at the very bottom, I have added that I'm the mother of 2 beautiful boys. I don't always put that in my lecture slides or even mention it in class, but for me, in context of this lecture, it's an important achievement to announce, and something that I'm really proud of. Raising boys in our world today, I think, is definitely the most important job that I've been put here to do. So without further ado, I am really pleased to be at this amazing conference, and thank you so much for having me. And we can, if you want to create the buzz, you can follow me on Instagram at CellarMuse and of course, Lift Collective. So this lecture represents years of research and interest for me, so I'm really pleased to present it to you today. Let's begin at the beginning with the discovery of wine. And I've been teaching wine history for almost 10 years at the college level. And I like to say that I look at history through the lens of wine, with wine as the protagonist. And I imagine, because some of history is imagining what, some of the study of history is imagining what the world was like in the past, that the very first contact that people had with wine or discovery of wine was made by a woman. So we understand that wine was discovered, not invented, during Neolithic times. And that's because Vitis vinifera, the genus and species of the climbing grapevine that we make wine with, is an extraordinary symbiotic partner to settled civilization. And it has within it, inside of the berry, enough sugar to ferment an alcoholic beverage that will intoxicate. And on the outside of the berry, it gathers and collects enough yeast to inspire an alcoholic fermentation strong enough to convert those sugars to alcohol, therefore intoxicate us. And so Vitis vinifera is indigenous to the Near East and Europe, which means that this discovery is really part of the history of Western civilization. And so during the Neolithic Revolution, which was roughly 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, people were hunting and gathering, and they were nomadic. But during this period, they were beginning to settle down, keep animals, tend crops. And it's very possible that wine was one of the first impetuses for to stay in one spot, because we know that wine, the grapevine takes several years actually to be ready to bear fruit enough to make wine. But let's talk about why we wanted to make it in the first place. So I imagine this Neolithic woman. She gathers these grapes and she puts them in a satchel or a gourd, and she places them somewhere in the corner of her cave, and she forgets about them. And maybe a few days later or a week later, she comes upon this satchel, and it smells terrible, and it's bubbling and frothing, and really probably quite terrifying. It's transformed into an odious liquid that could possibly do her harm. But I also imagine that in Neolithic times, people were didn't take the decision to waste food lightly. And so she decided that she was going to consume this beverage anyway, right? So what had happened is that the weight of the berries had crushed upon themselves, releasing the juice to contact the yeast, and fermentation had started. So she drinks this liquid, and she doesn't die. Something beautiful happens to her. Her cares are alleviated. And I imagine the Neolithic life was full of cares and pain and suffering. And she's transported to another place. So her cave mates come back, and she says to them, this most extraordinary thing has happened to me. You have to try it, and we have to repeat it. And thus, I imagine, began the quest to systematically produce this wonderful beverage that we love today. And not soon after this moment, assuredly, the quest to make good wine began. And so I didn't coin this phrase, the power to banish care. Actually, I have to give that one to Hugh Johnson, the great Hugh Johnson. But I love this notion that the first attraction to wine was its power to banish our cares. It banishes our cares through intoxication, but it also banishes our cares through the sensory pleasure that we experience through drinking wine. And so this is valuable and powerful stuff, right? This is the stuff that societies, economies have been built upon. And this is one of the great reasons that from the very beginning of our record of wine, we see people deciding who can drink it, who can have access to it, and who will benefit from what I refer to as the power, privilege, and prosperity that wine and the wine trade brings to those who interact with it. So from this early time, this question comes up: is wine good or is wine evil? And you can imagine that that first moment included fear and awe and joy and all kinds of emotions on both sides of the spectrum. And so from our very first written record of wine and pictorial record of wine, we see people grappling with this idea: is it good or is it evil? And so the very first wine trade actually happened in ancient Mesopotamia. And actually, as you can see on this map here, shows this origin place of wine. So we think that wine was first discovered up here in the Caucasus Mountains. And then in ancient Mesopotamia, it was traded down the rivers Tigris and Euphrates to the people of Sumeria, ancient Sumeria, which was much more arid. So they didn't make the wine down in arid Sumeria, they made it up in the mountains, in the Caucasus Mountains. And so this was the beginning of the first wine trade that then moved out through Phoenicia into the Mediterranean, but we'll come back to that in a moment. And so this first wine civilization was probably ancient Mesopotamia. And we actually also find the very first writing in Western civilization, possibly first writing in the world, comes from this culture in the form of the language cuneiform, which was actually the very first written language derived from a trade notation. And if wine was one of the most powerful trade commodities, then certainly wine would have been one of the first things that was written about. So I also like to kind of imagine that wine was one of the first things to be described in writing. But certainly, so this actually, we think you could picture this time as being roughly between 3500 BC and 3000 BC. But by 1772, we have the Code of Hammurabi come into being and written in cuneiform, most famously known for the law an eye for an eye, right? But also within the Code of Hammurabi were many rules and laws describing and codifying the wine trade, including that we know from this document that women were tavern keepers, and they were also beer brewers in ancient Mesopotamia. So we don't have a description of women making wine because remember, wine wasn't made down here in the in the lower parts of Mesopotamia. But women kept the taverns and brewed beer. And in fact, one of the very first important female rulers in the world that we know of was a bartender. She was a tavern keeper, and her name was Kubaba, or Kungbao in the Sumerian language. And she supposedly lived about 5,000 years ago and supposedly reigned for over 100 years before passing the kingdom to her son. So she was a wonderful, great, and heralded ruler. And a tavern keeper. And so we also see laws that say things like, that show us this struggle between good and evil, that say things like, no politics should be conducted in taverns, i.e. when people are intoxicated, and priestesses should not be allowed to drink in taverns. That implies that women who were not engaged in religious activities could drink in taverns, right? If we're specifying priestesses. So we think women could drink. Women kept taverns. Women had certain amount of rights and agency in this culture if one of their most important rulers was a woman, right? So we know that women engaged in property ownership could pass ownership of said property through themselves, and also were documented in their own names and could bring charges against men for sexual misconduct. So in this society, women had a lot more freedom and power than in some subsequent societies that we'll get to. So wine moves out of the Near East through Phoenicia, or present day Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon, and through the trade with the Phoenicians, or the people of that area, known as the Fertile Crescent. The people of Egypt discover wine through actually the timber trade with the Phoenicians. And they've got a wonderful story about early contact with wine. And this story is about the goddess Sekhmet. So Sekhmet was a Nubian warrior goddess. She came from deep within Africa, and she was a lion goddess, so wild and fierce. And she arrives in Egypt, and she is horrified by the greed and unkindness of the people of Egypt. And so she begins to to wreak havoc and rain her wrath upon the people of Egypt. And supposedly her breath dried out the desert. And so the other gods of Egypt get together and say, okay, we have to stop her. And what shall we do? So because she's from deep within Africa, she doesn't know wine. And so we should give her red wine, or in some stories it's beer stained with pomegranate juice, but I'll use wine for the purposes of this story. And we'll give her this red alcoholic beverage and intoxicate her to appease her and tell her that it is the blood of her enemies. And so they do, and she becomes intoxicated, and through that she is calmed. And wine has this transformational effect, bringing her peace. She becomes the goddess Hathor, the goddess of gratitude, healing, dance, and drunkenness. So she becomes the pussycat goddess Hathor. And throughout ancient Egyptian society, actually, every other year, I think it was, a festival of drunkenness was held in her honor, just to make sure that her mood was continuously appeased. So drunkenness was actually celebrated in ancient Egypt. And interestingly enough, as I mentioned, throughout ancient societies and throughout all of Western history, we see ruling people decide who is going to be excluded. So someone seems to always be excluded. In the case of ancient Sumeria, it was about economics, right? The common people drank beer because wine would have been very expensive after it arrived downriver. And the same was true in Egypt, where most of the wine had to be imported. They did make wine, and actually women were known for tending the vines, and actually keeping books and records, and involved in all aspects of business. And we believe in the wine trade as well. But so while some wine was made in Egypt, most wine had to be imported, and so it was very expensive. And so here we see an exclusion based on social stature, right, rather than gender. So the ruling class, who believed that they were descendants of gods, had the wine, and the common people drank, again, beer. And so because wine was considered this kind of porthole to the afterlife and to the godly realm, the ruling class believed that really that they inherent in their moral superiority, right, as descendants of the gods, they were capable of managing this tool, intoxication, right? And that common people were not, so they were excluded. Cleopatra later famously was known for displaying her power by bathing in wine and pretty much drinking it morning until night. She believed that it imbued her with her sexual power, which was, the quintessential essence of who she was, right? And because intoxication was acceptable for this ruling class, you see a lot of images of wealthy people, women and men, becoming way over intoxicated. So you can tell this is a privileged woman because she has this cone on her head, which indicates her connection with the gods. And here, this lower class woman doesn't have the cone, right? She's serving. So from the very beginning, we have this association of wine with privilege, right? And that continues in various ways throughout the ancient world. And I want to talk about Greece, Rome, and Etruria kind of in the same context. So about 800 BC, the Greeks arrive and expand their empire to include the Italic Peninsula. And the Greeks had already established this very wealthy empire built with its economics on their wine trade. So they share this culture with the Romans who come up later. And for both the Greeks and the Romans, it's really essential within their culture that women be systematically excluded and marginalized within society. And so it may be kind of a hard concept to accept, but really in the birth of democracy, kind of at the core of democratic thinking, is the exclusion of women. This idea that in Greek and Roman society, men got together and decided that they were going to have this wonderful world where men had all these incredible equal rights and privileges. And specifically, women were excluded. And the reason that they were, in my opinion, specifically excluded was because women, of course, bear children. And if women have power, agency, and are able to own property in their own names, then men have very little economic and political power. And so controlling women's sexuality through property ownership was essential to the creation of Greek and Roman society. So the economics of names, owning property in your own name, being able to pass it to your children is really essential. And that was reserved for men. And in order to do that, women had to become property of men, right? So in Greek society, they had this wonderful event called the Symposium. And this was a place, not unlike this conference, where people would come to share ideas. And here we're talking about wine, but they would come there to drink wine and share ideas. But women were notably excluded from these events unless you were a courtesan and there to entertain in various ways, right? Here you can see the men reclining and drinking, and on this wine vessel, serving vessel, and the woman playing the flute here. When the Greeks arrived on the Italic Peninsula, they discovered a society along with the pre-Romans who inhabited the south. They discovered a society that inhabited the north and the central part of Italy that were very different from them. These were the Etruscans. And in Etruscan society, women had equal rights to men, we believe. We know very little about Etruria, except through art and architecture and the stories that other people told about them. But we know that women had used their own names and were really considered equals. We see in art women wearing the same clothes as men and being pictured alongside on the same plane as men with really forthright presenting images of women. So in Greek and Roman art, often we see women with their face to the side or up or somehow demurred. And in Etruscan art, women are always pictured very forward and also often in the same clothing that men wore and doing the similar jobs that men did. So of course the Greeks and the Romans hated the Etruscans and finally wiped them out in 146 BC at the end of the Punic Wars. And they told all kinds of salacious stories about the Etruscans and especially about the Etruscan women. I think we should take them with a grain of salt because the women of Etruria were very threatening to them. So I'm not so sure that they were really that outrageous. In fact, we believe that the Etruscans valued a monogamous marriage set of values, and probably they had happy long marriages because women were empowered and had equal rights, in my personal opinion. And so women certainly in Etrurian society took part in the wine trade. So through ancient Greek and Roman cultures, we see actually throughout all of the ancient world, we see this association with wine, intoxication, and spirituality, mysticism, right? And so prior to Dionysus, who was the very first god to be entirely devoted to wine, he was a Greek god who later in Roman society became known as Bacchus. All of the gods that interacted with wine were agricultural gods, and they were women, they were females. So he was the first male god, and also became then the first exclusive wine god. And I don't think that this is an accident. This indicates this shift in taking control in the masculine part of society rising to power. So he was a gender bender. He is the perfect example of this transition from a more feminine matriarchal societies to the patriarchy. Often he's pictured looking very feminine, even with breasts, basically. And so women would, in these really, societies that really excluded women, would engage in these festivals where they went out into the woods and they drank and they danced. And it was the one time of the year where they could really release and be themselves. And so, of course, the Greeks and the Romans said these were known as the Bacchanalia, or the Dionysian mysteries. So the Greek and Roman senates set about to outlaw these festivals because they found them very, very threatening. And finally, the festivals were fully sanctioned and controlled, and then came about into a regular cultural event. So it's kind of like Woodstock and then Woodstock reboot. So the publicly acceptable mysteries after the 5th century were probably much more tame. And the process of this transformation of essentially the kind of wild feminine nature to this more controlled human nature is best probably described in the Greek play, The Bacchae by Euripides, which is a famous Greek tragedy. It's a story of intoxication, betrayal, violence, murder, and collective hallucination, and drunken women. And it's essentially a huge propaganda against women drinking. In this story, which you can see here, the women in this mass hysteria, drunken hysteria, hunt down the queen's son, who they think is a panther, and they kill him and parade him through town, showing the pride of their hunt. So it's a horrifying story that was meant to scare off people from women drinking, essentially. But as we move into the Christian era, after Rome falls and Christianity rises in Europe, this idea of taking, when we drink wine, taking the God into us continues, actually. This is what we thought when Greeks and Romans were drinking, they thought that they were taking the wine god into them, right? And in Christianity, that is also true. The idea that you were taking in Jesus says, drink, this is my blood, right? So these same mythologies kind of persist. But we see this even bigger shift to the hierarchy of the male god, the line of male priests and kings, right? Be deeper solidified in society, this exclusion of women. Women's rights were extremely and further limited. Access to education was virtually non-existent. Women became even more deeply property of men, and essentially were degraded to this, in this conceptual realm of either being the temptress or the saint. This is also how the Greeks viewed, of course, the Etruscan women, remember? And there's no in between. And really what that means is that there's no place for women, because as we all know, women are not just a temptress or just a saint. We are many things that include our whole selves and our sexuality and our femininity. So I think that this idea of the temptress or the saint is one of the most profoundly damaging and persistent notions in Western civilization that have kept women from succeeding on their own terms. But even in Christian Europe, women had roles to play in the wine industry. These are images from the Tarbes Abbey near Dijon, and the Les Dames des Tarbes were the nuns who were the Cistercian nuns who were associated with the Citeaux Abbey, which was their father abbey, right? They were famous for certain great climats of Bourgogne, the Clos d'Etard in Maurice Saint-Denis, most famously, Le Musigny, and remember Bonne-Mare, right, the good women. So some of these great vineyards were associated and tended by these nuns. And so women were actually involved in this early period of discovery and exploration of terroir in the world's most important and famous region for understanding terroir, Bourgogne, right? Although they don't often get cited as such. And this is actually a picture of a tin sculpture that says Mata, which means the mother goddess. This is found very nearby to the Abbey of Tarbes outside of Dijon. So the mother goddess and the matriarchal spirituality doesn't completely go away, but it goes very deeply underground in Christian Europe. So throughout this period, women continued to be seen as property of men, and powerful women were pawns of that, that quest for power through marriage, right? So women were essentially traded in the process of European nation building. And I'd like to talk about Catherine de' Medici just a little bit, because she actually gave quite a lot to Europe. She brought the fork to France, and she could probably be attributed to the birth of French cuisine, and also possibly to bringing the Cabernet family, probably Cabernet Franc at the time, back to central Italy. So she was a Tuscan woman, and she was traded in marriage to become the Queen of France. And she's an often maligned figure. She's most famously known for killing Huguenots and being incredibly ruthless. But she also was noted as saying that the happiest time of her life was a time when she was being educated in the convent while waiting for marriage. And that fact actually draws me a little bit towards her and brings some compassion in me for her as a woman and as a human being who was caught in this terrible place in society for women, and that her happiest time was when she was free of all of that, of being a pawn. Powerful women throughout history have often been described as ruthless or catty or even the B word, right? But really, I think that it's this restrictive and kind of dangerous patriarchal society that forces women into these roles instead of into a place where they can celebrate one another and create healthy feminine aspects to our society. So Catherine represents some of that for me, kind of a person who was lost there. She actually hated her husband so much, they didn't get along. This is how she brought cuisine to France, actually, that she brought her entire kitchen entourage to France with her. And in order to get away from court, because everybody knows that Henry had a mistress, Diane de Poitiers, who was very present in court, she set about on really the first cooking roadshow, where her and her chefs taught wealthy noble families how to cook. And prior to this time, the cuisine of France was probably rather barbaric, and they stabbed their food with knives. And later would develop, of course, the cuisine of France that's based in sauces and elaborate cooking techniques that were born actually in Italy. So thank you, Catherine. So as French society continues to evolve, women, of course, don't have a lot of rights and privileges, but it's surprising that through the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Code, the creation of the Napoleonic Code, women's rights are actually the exclusion of women's rights from Western society and French society are formalized in a really kind of terrible and powerful way through the Napoleonic Code. So the Napoleonic Code went into effect in 1804 just 6 short years after the French Revolution. And it was a code, a progressive legal system that's often, really heralded as being eliminating feudalism, supporting religious tolerance, and creating liberal society across Europe. It was based on Roman law, of course, which also was quite great if you were a man. But there was really a dark side to women from the Napoleonic Code, and not just in France, because the Napoleonic Code was echoed in the civil codes that came about throughout the rest of Europe and also the world after this time. So it was a very influential and important legal moment. So it described specifically, it affirmed the legal rights of men over women, affirming male supremacy in society in many powerful ways. Women were described as subordinate to either their fathers or their husbands and had no individual rights or economic freedoms. If they were, and in the next point, I say that it virtually eliminated male accountability for sexual acts. This is by solidifying the economic line through men, by making women not equal citizens in their own right. Or bastard children, of course, were excluded from the rights of succession, which meant that men weren't responsible for them. Also, women lost the right to bring about charges of misconduct against men, and if they were wronged, those charges had to be legally brought by either their fathers or their husbands, and nobody believed women. So this is really kind of the part of the enshrined political beginning of it being okay to treat women however, and not believe them when they say that things happen the way they happened, right? Women's sexuality was criminalized outside of marriage. And so it's really shocking to kind of, when we look at this, to understand, also a divorce by mutual consent was abolished officially with the Napoleonic Civil Code. So many, many things that really gave women a disadvantage in society. And it's surprising to know that these laws were not reformed in France until after World War II. So women in France didn't get suffrage until 1944, and these laws weren't fully corrected until the 1970s. So it gives a little insight into a country that we think of as so incredibly progressive for women. If you look at the other side of it, the kind of over-sexualization and focus on women as the temptress in France is quite extreme. And that's worked, I think, against women, and it's often overlooked. But, so just to kind of head back in time. So if we imagine this world where women don't own property, women certainly can't run wineries, there was a loophole. And you're all, I'm sure, familiar with the famous widows of Champagne. And I have had students ask me, well, with all of these exclusionatory laws against women, was murder or, popular during this period, women murdering their husbands? And I don't have any evidence of that. The loophole was something else, actually. And the reason for these important, powerful women in Champagne was otherwise. Because Champagne, since the beginning of European history, has been at the front of every war. And so their men died in these wars, and many women were widowed. So it gave women an opportunity to be part of creating the wine industry and culture there. Most famously, probably Nicole Barbe-Ponsardin-Clicquot. And I like to refer to her by her name because specifically women weren't referred to by their names. So instead of calling her the Veuve or Veuve Clicquot, which demeans her just to her relationship to her husband, who none of us know or need to remember, Nicole Barbe was known for inventing probably the most essential and important part of the traditional method of creating sparkling wines, riddling and disgorgement of the dead yeast cells to make a clear, beautiful sparkling wine. Louise Pommery was another great widow who was the first to market a zero dosage wine. Her market was the English. Nicole Barbe's wine was quite sweet. Her market was the Russians. And this wine, Louise Pommery's wine, was called brutal or brutal for how dry and austere it was. And so this is where we get our first brut wine. Lily Bollinger was this kind of lovely and much beloved and slightly more contemporary widow in Champagne, who was famous for saying, "I drink champagne when I'm happy and when I'm sad. Sometimes I drink it when I'm alone, When I have company, I consider it obligatory. I trifle with it when I'm not hungry, and I drink it when I am. Otherwise, I never touch it unless I'm thirsty. So, words to live by. And before we move into American history and how this affects American women, I want to just take a look at advertising. I collect vintage advertising and like to think a lot about the meaning of these images and the context under which they were created. So if you look at these three images, which were all wine advertisements created in the 1920s, I'm going to draw attention to my favorite, the one in the middle. This is from Germany in 1925, I think it was. And so women in Germany gained suffrage and voting rights in 1918. So here is a woman being depicted in her full kind of joy with wine. She's drinking wine for herself, for her own pleasure. And this is really powerful. I love this image so much. And I really think that, of course, there's a lot of power in propaganda and advertising. And I'd love to see, I think this would be a really great moment to see powerful images of diversity in our wine industry today. And if anybody knows of any, you can email me and send them to me, or if you want to create them for your company, I encourage you. But I'd like to see a more diverse set of images celebrating people in their joy with wine. So this is my favorite. In this image here, we see a gentleman drinking champagne. Of course, he's dreaming of naked women dancing. So this really, kind of represents a bit more the France that I described, a couple slides ago. And this image here is interesting too. It kind of combines the temptress and the saint. Here, this woman is kind of a nature nymph. She represents mother's milk, right? So the most pure and wholesome thing about femininity. And also she's incredibly sexy and she's spewing champagne out of her breasts, right? So this was an advertisement made by the French, targeted at the English, which I feel kind of represents their kind of interesting, tricky relationship culturally about sexuality, and the fact that the French say, well, we've got the wine, we've got the women, come over here. So I just wanted to point out the power of advertising as we think about how we might affect our actions in the wine industry today. And so moving into American wine history, I want to take a look at how women's suffrage and prohibition were connected, and so how America's complicated relationship with alcohol is important for us to understand as Americans in an effort to transform our wine industry. And so this is really part of the systematic roots of exclusion of women and also people of color, which we'll talk about in a moment, in America, was this moment of prohibition. And so right after the American Civil War, drinking is at an all-time high, and we see very few restrictions on production of sale or alcohol. We also have President Lincoln's expansion initiatives through the Wild West, which we'll talk about in a moment. And so there was very little oversight, and drinking was rampant. In fact, your average adult at this time was documented as consuming 9.5 ounces of spirits a day. And so that means women were not drinking. So that means men were drinking double that much, at least, right? Since actually there may have been more women alive at that time after the American Civil War. So there was a real serious ill with alcohol in America at this time. Drinking was out of control. And that meant that there was a lot of violence against women, violence, abuse, abandonment of women and children. And this was a serious issue. And so here you see these pious and upright women picketing in front of a tavern. And this is really important. These were women who were not taught to stand up for themselves, were not taught to speak forward. But this issue was so essential to the fabric of American society that it made activists out of them. And it really birthed the women's rights movement in many ways. It is inspired the suffrage movement, in fact, because women realized that without votes, they were never going to achieve prohibition. And so the 18th Amendment was passed actually in 1919 without women voting, but these two movements came up at the same time. So by the time Prohibition was passed, also women were given suffrage later that year, or in 1920, at the same time that Prohibition actually went into effect. And this was the beginning of a different America in a lot of ways. So during Prohibition, actually a different result happened. We have women who were now voting, who were now empowered in a different way, and we had alcohol was illegal. So when women were drinking, they were out of the eyes of respectable society. And that meant that in these underground bars, these speakeasies, men and women were drinking together, right? And women were making, or mostly probably distilling and brewing and making you know, homemade wine from dehydrated grapes as well. And so there's actually an additional dark side to this period. And I want to talk about how Prohibition relates to xenophobia and racism. So when it comes to the exclusion of certain peoples based on race, exclusion from the wine industry, there are many systematic barriers that relate to this historical moment. So there's also, there's a history of trauma and a real need to transform and create more positive narratives for some of these communities as well. But essentially, Black, Indigenous, people of color have been excluded from the 3 Ps, or the power, privilege, and prosperity of the wine trade. And even more than that, specifically, alcohol in many cases has been used against these communities as a tool against equality in our society. You can see this image here of the Ku Klux Klan, who were great supporters of Prohibition, and this picture was taken in 1920, marching right at the time of that Prohibition was enacted. So I want to connect to this moment in history in the subject of exclusion based on race. Emancipation happened in 1863, and in 1870s was the beginning of the Prohibition movement. So at this time, white Americans were anxious about a growing middle class of Black people. And as I mentioned, people were pouring into the West. Manifest destiny was on the minds of European settlers. And wars were being waged against tribes. The Indian Removal Act was being enforced, which moved tribal people from their land and relocated them to reservations. And alcohol was also traded and distributed. And during this period, there was a lot of terrible propaganda. So remember the power of advertising, right? During Prohibition, there was a lot of powerful propaganda that leveraged anti-Native, anti-Black, racism, anti-Semitism, and anti-immigrant sentiments by picturing specifically Black and Native men as these drunken, dangerous people at large in the community, to kind of instill fear and hatred amongst white people. And that went really hand in hand with this idea of sending the message to abolish alcohol in America, right? So there's many diverse stories for Indigenous American populations in relationship to alcohol. And so I'll speak mostly from my own experience. I grew up in my Lakota grandfather's house, and my father was an Indian affairs attorney. But in my experience and observation, many Indigenous people associate alcohol with trauma and colonialism. So in order to overcome the barriers of and include some healing, possibly reparations, regarding land and taxation have to happen. Those things are happening somewhat in Canada, which is a really interesting story for another time. In order for equity and inclusion efforts to really take root in Indigenous populations in the American wine industry. But back to this moment of time in Prohibition, for Black communities, just like for women, this moment actually propelled a movement towards more inclusion and integration. Because these bars were secret, private, and illegal, Black and white people were drinking together. White people were going uptown to Harlem to listen to jazz. And here you see actually white waiters waiting on Black listeners in a jazz club. So people were, were in these same neighborhoods, and most of the neighborhoods where these speakeasies were more poor neighborhoods and sometimes Black neighborhoods. So this moment has a lot of kind of tragedy and negativity when we look at the roots of systematic exclusion for people of color in America, but also there's some interesting transformations that happened during this period. But certainly alcohol is complicated in America. And in regards specifically to equity and inclusion efforts for today, we have to take a look at this history. We have to face it in order to affect the real kind of change that we want and move forward to a society, not just a wine industry, where people have equal opportunities to thrive and be themselves. And specifically, of course, in the wine industry, which is the focus why we're here today. And so with that, I want to start the shout out period of this lecture. I just want to show some of these tenacious women who have, against all of these odds, succeeded at making positive impacts to the American wine industry. So all the way back from the very early American wine industry, we have some women, actually, some Black women as well. And I just want to say, if you think about Black people, Black and Indigenous people being, the least included, then Black and Indigenous women are have the very least opportunities in the wine industry systemically, based on our history. So it's important to kind of recognize that. And yet, women, Black and white women, have overcome these obstacles. And so I would like to introduce you to Ellen Mary Stewart, after which Glen Ellen, the town in Sonoma, was named after, the very famous wine town. She inherited her property. She was a widow, and at this time, American hereditary laws, or American laws, were actually modeled after the British Commonwealth common laws, which were similar to the Napoleonic Code, not quite as exclusive, but it was difficult for women to operate businesses on their own. And Mary Ellen Stewart inherited a winery from her husband, and along with a couple of her neighbors who were also widows, they petitioned to become sole proprietors of these businesses, and really were important movers and shakers in the early Sonoma wine industry. And also in that same community, there was a woman named Mary Ellen Pleasant. She was a woman of mixed race who often passed as white. Her story is a little bit lost in the mist of time, but we believe that she was born either a slave or an indentured servant in the North. And she was a financier, a real estate mogul, an abolitionist, and she owned a lot of property. She was the owner of the Beltane Ranch. She was married many times. And on her ranch was reported by the California Agricultural Board to have been planted to superior foreign varieties. So she was making wine. Isabel Simi is probably the most famous woman in early California wine industry, and she was considered to be famed for being the first female winemaker, really a prominent female winemaker. She inherited her winery when both her father and her brothers died from influenza. She was 18 years old. So I love this picture because look how happy she looks. She looks just like that woman in that advertisement. She looks really, truly in her joy. So I love that picture of her. I want to shout out just kind of quickly, there's a lot of names and pictures on this slide, but what happens next after our society begins to change, both in Europe and in America, is that men start to pass generational knowledge of winemaking to their daughters, which had not previously been done. And so this slide represents kind of a first wave of women who take the lead globally from their fathers, who learn winemaking from their fathers. And I apologize, there's a little formatting funny on this slide, but I'm gonna carry on anyway. So some great names in European wine, Saskia Prum, Veronique Drouin. I could talk for a whole lecture on all of these women, but I'm just gonna shout out their names. Trimbach in Alsace, Rothschild, Saskia Rothschild, Teta J. In California, Catherine Hall, Gina Gallo. In Italy, Elisabetta Foradori. And in Spain, too, we have women winemakers rising up and running and making wine in some of the most important wineries in Ribera del Duero, and Rioja. And in Oregon as well, we have pioneers of Oregon passing the reins to their daughters, like Luisa Ponzi. And so those women were, inheriting their wine knowledge from their fathers and their families, whereas I want to shout out this other set of women here on this slide, which I'm calling the American Trailblazers. And these are women for whom there wasn't a lot of precedent, or maybe there wasn't a road paved for them at all to enter the wine industry. Kathy Corison was famously told, "No, you can't," about 1,000,000 times, and she didn't believe it, thank goodness. She is, of course, a very important woman in the California wine industry, and also spoke at the very first Wonder Women of Wine conference. Kay Simon, also in Washington, of Chinook. Both of these women studied wine and opened their own wineries, and have been hugely impactful for women in the Washington and California wine industry. Tara Gomez, actually, who is the winemaker of Quita Wines. Here she is here. She's a member of the Chumash tribe in Santa Barbara. And she worked for Fess Parker and J. Lohr Wines before opening her own winery, which is I think it's the only winery in America that is fully operated and owned by tribal people. Theodora Lee is the owner and winemaker of Theopolis Vineyard. I love the name of her winery and her label as well. As a lover of wine history, I love this quote from her. She said, "I believe education is the key to promote more women in wine. Large wineries and winery associations should do more to educate the public in general and women of color about the opportunities in the wine business." So I, for one, am going to do my very best, Theodora, to do my part in that. I want to shout out Remy Drabkin. She's the owner of Remy Wines in Portland. And she's a gay Jewish woman. So three times in the underrepresented category. And she was featured in a wonderful documentary film called Red, White, and Black about Black and LBGT winemakers in Oregon. So check that film out. It's really cool. Vivienne Kennedy, who's actually a panelist in this conference, is a trans winemaker, also in an urban winery in Portland, Ram Cellars and Viv Wines. So here she is, also happy in her laboratory. And then Brene Royal is not a winemaker. She's a vineyard manager, but she manages probably the most valuable vineyard land in all of America, the Monte Rosso vineyard, which is owned by E&J Gallo and contributes to the Louis Martini wines. So she wrangles a team of men in the wilds of the Mayacamas Mountains, and she's a total badass, and I admire her quite a bit. And I love this picture of her too. I've just lifted it from the internet. I do know Brene, but I haven't taken any pictures of her that are quite this beautiful, really, in her joy. So all of these women in their joy, making wine and transforming our industry, I want to thank them. So to wrap up this short time that we have together, I really just want to instigate a little bit and inspire conversation about how we can do this, change our industry and our society. I think facing the facts is the first step. So men have more opportunities. White men have the most opportunities. And there's still a lot of inequity, even though we've come quite a ways, where women make up Washington wine industry just 3% of ownership. Oregon, 5% of wineries are women owned, and California also 5%. 10% of winemakers in California are women, but there's still a long way to go. So that's improvement. But I also want to face the fact that we are stronger together. So here is a picture of a Etruscan man and woman dancing and holding hands to inspire us, I think, because men are victims of this patriarchal construct in Western civilization as well. It has left its scars on men and women for millennia. And it's time to heal. I really believe that, that we will all be better off by transforming our society. So I want to finish with the idea that as women, we can abandon deficit mentality. We can create our own opportunities and draw them to us. And the idea that if we do that and we share those opportunities, there might actually be more opportunities for us, that we don't have to live in fear, that there's not enough room at the table, right? We can make a new table. We can change our society to be a better one. I think that I would like to invite women to own our mastery, to embrace our value and belonging without compromising our values or our identity, and also to learn how to negotiate your salary like a pro, because you know what? Men are doing it and they're succeeding. So in this together, I look forward to your questions and all of the conversations that this conference inspires. Thank you so much for joining me.